The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 6th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Then Jesus looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
If I'm being honest, I don't always love the Beatitudes, those blessings that we hear in the gospel, especially Luke's Beatitudes. I don't love them for All Saints Sunday. With the blessings and the woes, it seems to steer us in a direction that I don't know that I want to go, pitting us against them, saint versus sinner, blessing versus woe, now against then. I don't think that's Jesus' purpose here. In Luke, Jesus is always talking about reversing the current order of things, reversing expectations, toppling power structures, flipping things on their head. Just look at the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise after she becomes pregnant with Jesus. She talks about God casting down the mighty from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. And so I think these Beatitudes are another example of that. Whenever I read passages like this, these harsh words from Jesus, these woes sound like threats and ominous ones. Watch out, they say, or this could happen to you. But then, I wonder if they are more naming realities that have come to pass or more than likely will come to pass. And in the case of these woes, maybe it's naming two realities. One reality that states that when we live as a disciple of Jesus, our life will change. When we share what we have, we might individually have less, but the collective will have more. When we advocate for justice, we might lose the goodwill of people who profit off of others' oppression. When we can no longer ignore the suffering of others, our hearts will be open to feeling the communal pain. And then there's a second reality, a reality that states that nothing is permanent but God. Everything else can fade away, can be lost in a second, cannot be counted on, cannot be taken with us. Everything but God who loves us and has claimed us. So yes, woe to you who are laughing now, because there's no way that you could be laughing forever. Woe to you who are rich now, because you cannot take it with you. And so the challenge begins in verse 27 to everyone who is listening, not just those who might have blessings or woes directed at them, to everyone. And that bar is set high when it starts at verse 27. It may be that we've heard these things so many times before that we don't feel their full impact anymore, but these are hard things. Praying for people who persecute us, that's not easy. Giving away additional clothing to people who've already stolen from us. Offering up ourselves in a non-violent way when someone strikes us. Love our enemies. This is not easy. It's All Saints Sunday, the day that we remember those who have gone before us, who have passed along the faith to us, who have lived holy lives. And the tendency, when we think about the company of saints, is to think of them as paragons, as perfect. We have the fuzzy memory in our mind of people who were so faithful and so confirmed in their faith that they never faltered. But we all know that that's not the reality, that no person is perfect. And I can think of quite a lot of people who have fallen quite far from perfect, and yet who are still counted among that host. Because we trust and we believe and we know that they are with God, because God keeps God's promises. I want to share with you a story about my grandfather, who I think exemplifies this point that I'm trying to make. In 2014, a few months before I was ordained, my grandfather died. He was my mom's dad. My mom, if you remember, is a rostered deacon in the church. At the time, she wasn't a deacon yet, so she was still a diaconal minister. My grandpa was a Lutheran pastor, and he was a great carpenter. What he wasn't, however, was always easy to get along with. And as I talk about this, you probably have people in your own families, in your own lives, who meet some of this criteria. He had strong ideas about what was right and what wasn't right, which meant that there were a lot of topics that our family had silently decreed were forbidden to bring up with him. We didn't talk about education, because it would eventually lead to a discussion about how terrible the education system had gotten. We didn't talk about politics, because no one wanted to hear how the politicians he didn't like were ruining the country. We didn't talk about religion, if we could help it. My grandfather was not comfortable with women in leadership roles in the church, which meant that even my mother's role, then as a lay rostered leader, before we started using the language of ordination for deacons, even my mother's role was difficult for him to swallow. And the fact that I was planning to go to seminary was even more difficult to swallow. And he told me that Jesus called 12 disciples and not one of them was a woman. As you might imagine, this led to a pretty massive blow up with my family that ceased communication between him and my parents and my siblings and I for months. At least 6 months. This was my grandpa. I loved him, but our relationship was marked and broken by all the things we couldn't talk about and the things that he decided to say. Now, my grandma died a couple years before he did. Less than a year, actually, after that big blow-up, it was actually at Thanksgiving, that caused us to break that communication in our family. She was a quiet, sweet, faithful woman who had always been the one to smooth things over when conflict arose in our family. She was the one who made sure that we knew how much we were loved, even when our grandpa made us maybe doubt it. And when she died, my grandpa came to a realization. The day that she died, he started reading her journals. She had been keeping a journal since my mom was in her 20s. And in reading her words and her thoughts, he realized that he had been pushing everyone that he loved away, because my grandmother would have to call and make amends to bring everyone back in. And he realized that if he wanted to have any relationship with his children or his grandchildren, he needed to make a change, because my grandma wasn't there to do it for him anymore. And to our great surprise, he did. We went out for the funeral, and the week that we were there for the funeral, he told my mom that he was proud of her, something he had never said to my mom before in her adult life. When I graduated from seminary, I should say also, he sat me down that same week of the funeral and told me that the church was always going to be ready for things that he wasn't ready for. But that didn't mean that he didn't love me, and that if he was still around at my ordination, he wanted to be there. And so when I graduated from seminary, he gave me this cross, which my grandmother had given to him a couple years before he had retired. Some of the things that we could never bring up around him were now being talked about. Now, this isn't that he changed his mind overnight about his long-held beliefs. It wasn't that he was just brainwashed or mind-wiped. Instead, he realized that his relationships were more important than showing everyone else how wrong they were. By the time he died, my family was thankful that we had had at least a few years of being in relationship with him in a way that was actually nice. It didn't erase all the difficult years, the hurt and the pain that we went through, but it was important for us to know that he loved us and supported us. So when we attended his funeral in 2014, the sermon preached at his funeral ignored all of that pain and difficulty that we had gone through. Have you ever been to one of those services where you listen to the people talk about the person and you're like, I don't know who they're talking about? That was my grandfather's service. It painted my grandpa as a man that he wasn't, or at least as a man that he wasn't always to us. It lauded his ministry, his dedication to the church, which were both true, but it was a funeral sermon for a pastor without fault, not one for a man who I remember both denigrating my call as a pastor and acting out the story of the 3 little pigs to make my siblings and I laugh when we were young. To add to this, the person giving the sermon and leading the funeral never once referred to my grandpa by his name. He never talked about Emmett Schmidt, the father, the husband, the son, the grandfather. He only talked about Pastor Schmidt, the paragon of religious virtue. This is the problem that happens sometimes when we talk about saints. When we call someone a saint, we only want to look at their positive qualities. We only want to pay attention to the holy things that they did and ignore the rest. But a person's actions are not what defines them as a saint. Saint does not define someone by the life they lived, but by their status as a child of God. Pastor Schmidt was not a saint because he was ordained or because he preached the gospel or because he fed people with the body and blood of Christ. Emmett Schmidt is a saint because God claimed him in the waters of baptism and worked through him throughout his life. We know as Lutherans that being saint and sinner are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. And so while Grandpa certainly had his share of sins, we still call him saint. And we still count him among that communion that praises God without ceasing, along with so many others who we have loved and who have died. All Saints is often an emotional service, or even a sad one, especially for anyone who has lost someone recently, for whom grief is still fresh. But I want to remind you that All Saints is also a day of celebration. A day to give thanks for those people who we've loved. A day to acknowledge the reality of their lives and their status as a child of God. A day to remind ourselves of all the ways that we are still connected with them. If you ever need a reminder, my favorite thing to do is to look at our communion liturgy. Every week during the Great Thanksgiving, I say some version of, and so with all the choirs of angel, with the church on earth and the hosts of heaven, we praise your name and join their unending hymn. And then we sing, holy, holy, holy. In that moment, we are joined with that entire communion of saints who are already with God and who offer praise without ceasing. That moment breaks in and we're one. Saints in heaven, saints in this room, saints because God has made it so. Amen.